So the entire core rule section of the Dark Angels Codex has now been leaked to the internet. Let's take a look at a few of the most major changes, and I must admit, for a brand new shiny codex, there's quite a lot of bad news and nerfs. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Dark Angels, and in this video I thought we'd delve into the new codex for the Unforgiven. I'll be aiming to make a full proper review of the book just as soon as I can, but in the meantime let's take a look at a few of the highlights, some of the rules that I think that people are going to find most impactful when they change their armies to this new book. As mentioned, it looks like the vast majority of the codex is now out on the internet. It's been shared literally all over the place. It's in lots of different subreddits, loads of Discord servers, and I've had several people reach out to send me copies of the rules now. A massive thank you to all of you for that. I think it's maybe not too surprising that this kind of book leaks out a little bit early. They often tend to go early if they're shipped out in big boxes. Maybe a bit more chance that with these box sets being shipped out that people will get their hands on them who maybe shouldn't. In any case though, let's talk through the major changes for the codex, and I will be back for a full review shortly with going into a bit more depth onto the other things and a whole bunch of minor changes that I won't be mentioning in this one for brevity. So far the only thing that I've not seen leaks are the points pages out there, which to be honest maybe isn't the biggest loss in the world. The codex points in 10th edition are generally immediately redundant. They will be superseded by Games Workshop's digital download when the next Minotaur and Field manual updates. If you happen to have spotted it anywhere else in the wild, feel free to let me know where. I guess it could be handy enough to know the costs of some of the enhancements, though I suspect that the vast majority of other things are going to change, as if they didn't, the Dark Angels would be looking at really quite an underpowered codex, I think. I guess the other thing that I haven't seen yet is any details of the combat patrol. Will be interesting to cover that when we find out details of that. I'll certainly make a mention of it here on the channel if it's updated. For the actual rules details though, there's lots of changes to datasheets, including Lionel Johnson himself, though spoiler alert, it's not for the better I'm afraid. More stratagems and enhancements have escaped confinement for the Ravenwing and Deathwing detachments. There's details as to how the Ravenwing and Deathwing keywords get on other units in the codex, maybe a bit more generous than I'd expected. And unfortunately, as suspected, there are some heavy losses with removed units and war gear for the standard Deathwing Terminator squad that I'm sure really won't please people who had these models already. As you might guess from the tone of this, the reaction of the internet does seem to have been broadly negative so far to the Codex update. There's a lot of units and rules and stats that have all been toned down, and for an army that didn't really need nerfs, they were kind of mid-tier at best, and most of their armies tended to revolve just around, say, Azrael and a unit of Deathwing Knights, as opposed to really going heavy on their Codex unique stuff. My guess is that it might have been a book that went to the printers before the full launch of 10th edition. Obviously I don't really know that, but if it hadn't, I just can't help but think that they might have changed around the rules for the Unforgiven task force, which by all accounts just seems to be massively weaker than the other Codex detachments in Codex Space Marines. I guess for a raw power level point of view, points drops in the Minotaur and Field manual will be able to compensate for this if Games Workshop gets them right. I feel like to make a lot of these units competitively interesting though, there would have to be points cuts compared with where they are now, and some of them quite big to Lionel Johnson and the Deathwing Knights in particular. Let's jump into it though, and first off we'll start out with the removed units. These ones are pretty much entirely as I'd expected. Very easy to see coming with the things that Games Workshop no longer produces miniatures for. Though I feel like for veteran Dark Angels collectors they're not going to make people happy. The Ravenwing Talonmaster no longer has a datasheet. I'd guess he might well go to Legends. He was based on the old Landspeeder kit that no longer exists from Games Workshop for sale, plus the upgrade sprues with the Twin Assault Cannon and Twin Heavy Bolter. He did always feel like a slightly odd composite model to me, though definitely one that people had a lot of love for. He'd often been quite effective and rapid moving firepower in game. Otherwise, the Deathwing Strike Master no longer has a datasheet. He was sort of like the Deathwing Lieutenant that you could build from the Terminator/Command Squad box set. Again, that kind of follows trends with a lot of minor characters like that just getting rolled back into their units in 10th edition. The Deathwing Command Squad is also gone as well. Again, very predictable given that the Terminator Command Squad box set was replaced by a Deathwing Knight box that doesn't have any Command Squad pieces, and an upgrade sprue that also didn't have any Command Squad pieces either. I feel like that could be a bit of a competitive blow, that one, given that you could make really quite a big Deathwing unit that regenerated Terminators with its apothecary and also had bonus objective control. Could be a fun unit to build around, even if previously most people tended to go for Knights over them. Another thing that I was sort of expecting, though it is a bit of a disappointment, is that Deathwing Terminators lost the ability to mix and match Assault Squad Terminator gear in there. And again, that's going to be something that's pretty unfortunate for a bunch of collectors out there. If you want to run your Terminators with the Thunder Hammers and Storm Shields and the Lightning Claws, it is going to have to be with the core Codex Space Marines datasheet now, as opposed to mix and match in a Deathwing squad. That's definitely one disadvantage lost. That's definitely one advantage lost for them. I feel like there'll be a few Dark Angels collectors out there who have Hammer Shield and Missile Terminators models, as they had been quite an optimal loadout for some time in game. Otherwise, Ezekiel remains with his current model pictured on the datasheet. He's hilariously still a metal model in the Dark Angels range, I believe, which is kinda crazy in this day and age. As with a bunch of other Firstborn characters that have somewhat suspiciously stayed around when lots of other things have been axed, I feel like that's probably good news for him. At some stage down the line, I suspect that they'll remake Ezekiel in a new Primaris sculpt. I feel that there's at least a reasonable chance that come the next edition of the game, we might be in for a big Ravenwing and Ezekiel update. In any case though, it's definitely some heavy blows for the Dark Angels. They've lost 4 units, had significantly limited war gear for one of them, and they only gained one in the Inner Circle Companions. Next up, in a core rule that's slightly different to other codexes that we've seen, it looks like a bunch of core Space Marine units can gain the Deathwing or Ravenwing keyword. I was kind of expecting this to be on the detachments for the Company of Hunters or the Inner Circle Task Force, but it looks like it applies to all Dark Angels armies. For the most part, it is only really relevant for detachment-specific stratagems and enhancements in those 2 detachments, but I feel like it's interesting enough just, I guess, for lore and theming, saying what's Deathwing and Ravenwing and what isn't. Both sections do have some surprises. For the Ravenwing, it's not too surprising that they have mounted units, Outriders, ATVs, and bike chaplains there. That means the chaplain on bike will be able to take the enhancements, and also any vehicles that can fly get it as well. The Storm Speeders I was fully expecting, but it also includes the Space Marine Flyers as well, so Storm Ravens, Storm Talons, and Storm Hawks will all be able to take the Black of the Ravenwing alongside their Dark Talon and Nephilim. On the Deathwing side of things, there's perhaps some surprises as well. Again, no surprise that any Terminator keyworded units, such as the regular squad, the assault squad, and the characters all get it. But also the Blade Guard and the Blade Guard Ancient, they've been sort of designated that last time round, though I think that it's more surprising that both the Stern Guard and Vanguard veterans both seem to be playable by Dark Angels and also count as Deathwing now. There were units that they kind of had limited access to versus their company veterans that they had in the past. Otherwise, it looks like Land Raiders, Repulsors, and Dreadnoughts all gain the Deathwing keyword. That feels a bit more lore and theming sort of theme. It doesn't really seem to do a whole load in game with the actual options for the stratagems for the Deathwing and the Ravenwing. Otherwise, some core Codex datasheets picked it up as well, as it wasn't really a keyword before. Samael has Ravenwing, and then Deathwing is given to the Inner Circle Companions, and all the Codex unique characters aside from Samael and the Lion. Next up, there's been a fair bit of consternation about the Deathwing Knights and their power swords and maces and things. I'm not sure why, but in my last video about the Deathwing Knights, everyone seemed to think that the mace profile had just completely gone away. I really don't know where that came from, as it wasn't really implied by Games Workshop at all. The power weapon profile was just to show off the new unit in their battle report. Still though, despite the power weapons and the maces having different profiles, it's still not unfortunately great news for the Deathwing Knights. Their squad size has been capped at 5, which is a real blow to them. They were often used in big 10-man squads as particularly effective users of certain enhancements, characters, or stratagems. Being locked to 5-man squads I think is going to mean that they're used in a very different role. Then for the choice between their mainline weapons, their maces have got slightly worse. 4 attacks hitting on a 2 at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2, so that's down from damage 3. And otherwise they have the option to trade out for the power sword, 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 2, damage 1, again hitting on a 2+. Overall, it does feel like those profiles are at least fairly well balanced, though either way the Deathwing Knights won't be punching up anywhere near as hard against tough vehicles anymore. I feel like damage 3 wasn't exactly overpowered for the maces, given that AP 1 meant that not really that many wounds went through. I can't help but think that people might have preferred them to be a bit more dangerous and cost a few more points if there was a choice. Otherwise, there was also quite a lot of consternation about the flail not having a listed profile in the kit. Instead, though, it basically still gets rules in all but name. The Knightmaster perhaps gets a surprisingly savage attack profile, 6 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 with lethal hits. That's a profile that's significantly better than, say, a standard Space Marine Captain, which is fairly impressive. Lethal hits helps it punch up against the toughest stuff around, though it did get a bit of a side grade. The previous one had fewer attacks and lower strength, but did get devastating wounds and sustained hits rather than lethal hits, so again maybe a slight side grade here, though either way it remains a very good general purpose weapon profile. I feel like the Knightmaster is definitely going to be doing the heavy lifting for the squad. The points cost for the unit in the codex were rumoured really quite high at 290. Again, I wouldn't really stress about that too much currently. I treat it as a placeholder points cost and use the Minotaur and Field Manual as the actual legitimate one. When that updates, I'd certainly hope that Games Workshop would charge them at around about the same sort of price they were before, if not a bit cheaper due to the nerfs. They'd really have to not want to sell Deathwing Knights to us if they were going to price it like that. Depending on their final points cost, they could still be a genuinely great unit. -1 damage is very big, and they'd just be sort of more tanky Terminators that still do have some good threat. You just have to have them costed to a similar sort of level as the Terminators that they're competing against, as opposed to being vastly more expensive. One area that I think is just pretty much flat disappointment, though, is the Unforgiven task force basically being unchanged and actually being very slightly nerfed on one stratagem. I feel like this is one area that Dark Angels players might have had on their wish list for some improvement. Some of the stratagems and enhancements for the detachment are okay, though the core rule really is a letdown, just meaning that you get Objective Control 1 if you're battle shocked, which isn't nothing in certain games, and every so often it might gain you some VP, but at the same time you could have entire runs of games where it does nothing. I feel like this is maybe one of the clues that the codex perhaps went to the printers before any sort of feedback out of the 10th launch was heard. It does feel very underpowered compared with the other Space Marine detachments, and it's basically pretty much unplayed on the competitive scene. The only changes that I noticed to it were 2 CP for unbreakable lines. That used to be 1 CP for -1 damage when the enemy charged you, and was arguably one of the better stratagems of the whole detachment in my opinion, but now it's 2 CP for a -1 to wound under the same circumstances, which I think is just far less value per CP. -1 to wound is okay, but I just don't think it's the same level as -1 damage, which could be seriously good on damage 2 or damage 3 weapons, though I guess this one works against damage 1. 2 CP though just makes it far less efficient, although I suppose it's at least a battle tactic if you've got a captain, I guess. Still though, I would consider it a nerf. The only other change I think was the Heavenfall Blade enhancement being renamed to Weapons of the First Legion. No apparent rules change that I spotted, it's still the same +1 attack strength and damage, going to +2 of each if you're battle shocked. Still very weird that it's the sword that gets better when you're scared. Overall not the best news for Greenwing Dark Angels. Otherwise, I did do a focus review video of the Inner Circle companions that you might want to check out after this. Really lovely, totally not fallen models, and a nice return to robed and hooded Dark Angels infantry. The short summary of these guys is that they look like their Blade Guard, but slightly less dangerous and certainly less durable with no invulnerable save, fielded in models of 3 to 6 in a similar sort of manner. They get the Deathwing and the Tacticus keywords, they have 3 wounds and Objective Control 2, which I sort of wonder if that's a nod to the banner that they carry, which doesn't actually seem to have rules, but I suppose that would make them OC2 otherwise. The Greatsword profile each gets you 4 attacks at Weapon Skill 3+, Strike it at Strength 6 and AP -1. Kind of interestingly, they get a choice of different swing modes, either damage 2 and lethal hits for the strike mode that might help them punch up a little, or sustained hits 2 and damage 1 on the sweep mode, quite nice for clearing hordes. The profiles aren't awful if you want to be skirmishing against either Space Marine equivalents or anything that's slightly more hoardy, but the AP one is a bit of a killer against anything heavier than that. They won't generally be terribly dangerous against any tanks or vehicles, and particularly nothing with a 2+ save, and to be saving these on a 3+. Otherwise, they get a -1 to hit them if they're led by a character, so a little more durability there for bodyguarding them, and a +1 to hit if they can attack any enemies with the character keyword, a little bit more dangerous there. Again, reportedly, their codex printed points cost is around 105. That would be genuinely bad news if that's followed through with that, though I'd honestly suspect not. It would just be kind of madness to charge these guys more than Blade Guard, given that they're quite a bit less durable, though their damage output maybe isn't so far behind. The lethal or sustained hits is good, but coming at the price of AP -2 is a bit of a kicker. I think honestly these guys probably should have had at least AP2, if not more. I think they could have been fun as just a general purpose, very dangerous but fragile unit perhaps. They seem like they might be a bit more useful as sort of cheap character guards, maybe points cost somewhere around the 75 to 80 point mark might make them somewhat interesting. Next up, Lionel Johnson has also been somewhat toned down. In general in 10th edition right now, he's sort of fairly brutal on the damage and defense sort of side of things, but does cost a fairly spectacular 380 points. By far the biggest change for him, I think, is that his -1 to wound from the Emperor's Shield has gone away. He seems to have forgotten to learn how to turn it on again, and that did seem to be his problem in 9th edition. That profile did make him spectacularly tanky before, although he did cost 380 points, so I did think it was somewhat justified. I feel like he sort of gets into the level where there's only so much that any one melee character can contribute to a game, as there's a good chance that he might just get screened or ignored, and the enemy just focuses down the rest of the army if it's not convenient to kill him. Otherwise, his sweet melee profile goes from damage 2 to damage 1, though he still has the very scary lethal hits profile with the big damage 4 on the strike mode with Fealty. It does mean that he's significantly less good against 2 wound infantry though. Specifically, he won't be as good at killing Space Marine equivalents as he was before. Overall, I'd hope that when the field manual points do come out, he would get a pretty significant points cut for this. I feel like he needed one already at the 380 points that he were, and between these two fairly big rules nerfs, I think that he needs quite a bit more. Reportedly, the Codex points cost had him at 365 points, though of course that doesn't really mean anything at all, and the Minotaur and Field Manual points won't necessarily be anything like that. I would certainly hope for something significantly lower given these nerfs, maybe like 320 or 300 or something, and see how it goes from there. The Ravenwing Command Squad have had a big change as they've become 3 models only, and previously you could add extra Black Knights into them, and now they seem to be basically your way of making a supersized Ravenwing unit if you want to. Attach these 3 to potentially a 7-strong Outrider unit with an ATV attached, or a 6-strong Black Knight unit. It doesn't look like they can attach with Samael though. The champion gets the character keyword, giving you a mini character within the squad who could take enhancements, which could be quite interesting for the Ravenwing task force. I did think that it was kind of funny that the Narthesium for the Apothecary specifically says that you can't resurrect character or invader ATV models. I guess Games Workshop maybe have learned their lesson from early 9th edition and the Apothecary's resurrecting ATVs thing. Seems kind of fun though. I feel like the Ravenwing maybe lacked units that could get to just an absolute critical mass where they were really good and could provide a massive alpha strike with all their stratagems and things. These guys might give them a way to do that. Otherwise, there's a few more details for the Deathwing Inner Circle Task Force. I'll just pick out a couple of interesting things here. We already knew that their rule was vowed targets to nominate an objective and get +1 to wound against it. They've got a melee reroll stratagem that allows you to reroll wound rolls against units on that objective, and one that allows them to fight on death on a 4+, again +1 to the roll if it's on the vowed objective. From Games Workshop's previews earlier, Deathwing Assault seemed like a really interesting enhancement. 30 points to deep strike on turn 1 with a massive Terminator unit. Seriously scary amount of threat coming to the midfield very early in the game there. Besides that, for a couple of the other stratagems, they've got a Relic Teleportarium. You can deep strike a Deathwing unit anywhere that's 3 inches from the enemy, and you can't charge after. These stratagems always tend to be pretty good ones in each detachment that can access them. Means that you could be throwing a 10-man Deathwing Terminator squad into the backfield of the enemy army, and it's pretty good for doing secondaries and things, potentially even sneaking an objective if the opponent deploys off it slightly, or just getting the jump on a whole bunch of enemies that really aren't prepared for massive Terminator might. Theoretically, I guess you could use this to affect Vanguard veterans and get some pistol fire on the go. Seems a bit counterintuitive though, given that they like their melee. Otherwise, for 1 CP, there's one called Wrath of the Lion, a Deathwing infantry unit that charged gets to roll 1 dice per each model in the unit, and for each 4+, you get a mortal wound to a maximum of 3 on your target. Again, it's boosted on the vowed objective, it goes up to a 3+ on each model there. Feels perhaps a little bit unnecessary that it was locked to a 3 mortal wound cap, so it does prevent it from swinging high. Perhaps one to consider if you're genuinely in danger of not killing your target. Perhaps going to be most valuable against things that have a whole load of barriers to damage, things like high toughness, high saves, or high invulnerables. Asmodai has had his rather fun new miniature teased as well. Pre-Codex he was 70 points, though now he seems to have found himself a nice new power sword, all the better for making enemies repent extra hard. It does seem that his datasheet has perhaps seen some of the most changes out of any in the Codex. He can now lead Blade Guard, Inner Circle Companions, Infernus Marines, and Hellblasters. Being able to lead Blade Guard is really quite a major win for him, given that he was kind of struggling to lead things that had meaningful melee before, and that did hold him back. Blade Guard had definitely helped with that, though even with them, I suppose he'd face stiff competition from things that could actually buff their wound roll or make their kind of lowest strength 5 wound tough stuff reliably. Otherwise, again, the Deathwing keyword, his bolt pistol got upgraded to a new and fancy heavy bolt pistol. His Blades of Reason that gave him some extra weak melee attacks don't seem to have been incorporated into his melee weapon profile anymore. I guess when he's in combat he's too busy wielding that Crozius paired with a power sword, where now he's also gained a sweep and strike type profile. The strike profile is a Relic Crozius sort of profile at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. That is an improvement from AP 1 before, and the sweep mode is completely new, 8 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. Overall he'll have a bit of extra punch against both hordes and heavies. Seems fine enough, but I still feel like he's going to be a character that's got a lot of stiff competition for leading melee specialists around. Finally, for a few of the other new things from the Company of Hunters, this one's the Ravenwing formation. As per Games Workshop's previous previews, we know that Outriders became battle line in this detachment, so it means that you could take loads of them, although the Outrider datasheet is kind of weak at the moment. Otherwise, their core Masters of Maneuver rule means that you get to advance and shoot, or fall back and shoot, something that is handy for a bunch of the Ravenwing units like all those Plasma Talons, the Land Speeders, or even the Planes perhaps. Though it is kind of interesting for just Space Marine tanks and shooty dreadnoughts in general, or maybe even Eradicators given their close range and the fact that they don't like to get locked up in close combat. Otherwise, for a few of the new stratagems, they've also got Rapid Reprisal. This one's a return to reserve special rule for a Ravenwing unit, triggered in the normal way if they're not in engagement range and at the end of the enemy fight phase. I feel like this one might be a little bit mid for Ravenwing. It's really quite good for slow moving units, but for units that actually have a whole load of speed, you might just want them on the board where they were. Unless they're just massively isolated, they're going to be able to reach enemies on the board already. Particularly with advance and shoot, you should be able to get to an objective, if not an enemy squad, I'd guess. Otherwise, for 1 CP, there's Hunter's Trail. This one allows a Ravenwing mounted unit to mark a sticky objective in the command phase. If it controls that objective in the command phase, it remains yours for the rest of the game, unless your opponent takes it at the start or end of any turn. I guess theoretically that could be handy enough, could maybe allow the Ravenwing to push onto an objective and keep up the offensive. Otherwise, for a couple more of their enhancements, they've got Mounted Strategist. This one gives a Ravenwing model advance and charge and fall back and charge. That pairs really nicely with the detachment rule. Say for example, if you had that on a Ravenwing command squad in a maxed out unit of Outriders, their special rule is to advance 6 inches. Means that you could have the entire unit move 18 inches, fire off all their weapons to maximal effectiveness, and then also charge in. Seems pretty brutal on an alpha strike. I feel like when you're moving 18 inches and then still operating absolutely maximally, you're probably going to be hitting the enemy from far out of their range where they could hit you first with a lot of close range stuff. Otherwise, the Recon Hunter one seems to be another way of getting a similar sort of thing on the go. This one gives your unit scout 9 inches for the Bearer's squad. Again, if you apply that to the Ravenwing Command squad, that could be an absolutely massive unit moving into the midfield. Could be nice to secure the Alpha Strike, or potentially just remain safe turn 1 if the enemy rolls first. If they don't, you could almost near guarantee a first turn charge between 9-inch move normally, and then 12-inch moves for the bikes after that. I feel like it could be a good one to pair with some infiltrators like some scouts or something to maybe prevent that scout move from being screened by enemy scouts or infiltrators. Hopefully between that detachment and the points cost when we get them, there'll be enough interesting to make the Ravenwing a bit more viable again. In any case, I think I'll leave that there for this one. Overall, I'd certainly say that it doesn't look like the best news for Dark Angels collectors in general. Just a surprising amount of nerfs to units that really didn't feel like they needed them. And while there is some fun stuff from the new detachments, I'm genuinely not sure it's enough to make up, unless the Minotaur and Field Manual points do genuinely go down a fair bit. To be fair to them, there's every chance that they might, so I'm kind of happy to reserve judgment until then. Let me know your thoughts though. Are you interested to play the new detachment with these rules, or which bits were you a bit disappointed with the stats? Look forward to hearing your thoughts. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like it, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be making a full Codex review shortly, and hopefully a few other choice unit reviews for the Dark Angels over the next day or so. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.